For years, evolutionists have told us two things. First, that humans and chimps are 98.8% genetically identical, and second, that this is evidence for evolutionary descent from a common ancestor. But is this actually the case? Dr. Casey Luskin shares with us some compelling new evidence that, as we'll see, casts serious doubt on this entire narrative.
Chaos Theory.
Similarity.
My name is Casey Luskin. I'm Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. I have a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg. I'm also a California licensed attorney, have a law degree from the University of San Diego, and also bachelor's and master's degrees in earth sciences from the University of California, San Diego.
So I understand you've been looking at this controversy over whether we are 1% or more percent different in our DNA from chimpanzees. And you have described it as something of an icon of evolution. Can you explain what the issue is? And can you explain why you think it fits the definition maybe of an icon of evolution?
Yeah, so I'm sure that many of your viewers, George, for many years have heard the claim that humans and chimps are only 1% genetically different. And then people have used that claim as an argument for human-chimp common ancestry. We've all heard this claim. I've dug through the literature, both technical scientific journals and also the popular literature, folks like Bill Nye, media, and many sources have made this kind of an argument. Bill Nye, in his 2014 book, Undeniable, said that we are 98.8% similar, genetically speaking, to chimps, and that this shows that we share a common ancestor with them. The Smithsonian Institution, if you walk into their Human Origins exhibit at their museum in Washington, D.C., has a big exhibit on the wall, and it says, "You and chimps, 98.8% genetically similar." And it goes on to say that we're only 1.2% genetically different. And you can find many other sources that have said this statistic over the years, and they're using it as an argument for human-chimp common ancestry. So this qualifies as what the ID-friendly biologist Jonathan Wells called an icon of evolution. It's an argument for evolution that is very frequently used, but it's based upon false factual information. It's actually been known for a long time that we are much more than 1 or 2% genetically different from chimps. But there was just a paper that came out in April of this year in the journal of Nature by Yu et al. That sequenced for the first time complete telomere-to-telomere sequences of the chimp genome and other genomes of various apes. Earlier drafts of the chimp genome, many of them used the human genome as a scaffolding or a guide when they assembled these chimp genome assemblies. What that meant is that these earlier drafts of the chimp genome, they looked more human-like than they really were. But now what Yu et al. Did is they sequenced the complete ape genome from scratch, de novo, without using the human genome as a guide, and having the complete genome for the first time allows us to make a more accurate comparison. To make a long story short, this paper in Nature, Yu et al. Found that we are in total about 15% genetically different from chimps. That includes about 1.6% genetic difference from what is called the single nucleotide variation. Those are basically when you can align very large portions of the human and chimp genomes, and you just look at individual nucleotide letters that are different. 1.6% of the total genome is different. And then you can also compare sections of the genome that really you cannot align them. There's a gap in one portion of the genome compared to the other. That could be because it is simply just a section of the genome that's totally different. There's nothing like it in the other genome, or it could be because there are copies of repeats in DNA, and maybe one genome has 10 copies of a repeat, and then the other species has 20 copies of that repeat. And so there's different copy numbers on these repeats in the genome. So basically you can't align certain portions of the genome, so there's a gap in one genome compared to the other. 13%, about 13.3% of the genome, the human genome, cannot be aligned with the chimp genome because of what they call this gap divergence. And you can add up these two differences, basically 1.6% of the genome and 13.3% of the genome that are different, come up with a total amount that is about 14.9%. We can call it 15% genetically different. This paper, Yu et al. Also used another method called a progressive cactus alignment, and that method confirmed the first method I mentioned. It found with the progressive cactus alignment that we're about 15 to 16% genetically different from the chimpanzee when you look at the entire genome.
What would you say to someone who says, oh, the differences between chimps and humans are just junk DNA? It doesn't matter anyway.
A lot of critics have been arguing that, George. They've been saying that we can just ignore or dismiss this newly discovered DNA that's different between humans and chimps because they say it's just repetitive junk DNA. Well, it's very interesting. There was another paper that came out just a little bit right after the You et al. Paper came out in Nature by some of the same authors who were actually co-authors on You et al. So they were involved in sequencing these chimp genomes and these other ape genomes. And what this paper found is that much of the repetitive DNA that's different between humans and chimps involves what they call non-B DNA. This is DNA that helps to make structural changes in the shapes of the chromosomes of these different species. In fact, what this paper talks about is that different numbers of copies of these repeat DNAs can change the shape of the chromosomes in the nucleus of these organisms. And that has very profound implications for the way that these chromosomes are arranged in the nucleus and the way that they interact with one another. And that can affect things like replication of DNA, gene expression, where centromeres are located, and many other important genomic functions are implicated by changes in the number of repeat copies, which changes the shape and the structure of the DNA, which changes the way these chromosomes are oriented in 3 dimensions in the nucleus, which then affects things like gene expression, replication of DNA, centromere function and location. So this is very important DNA. It's not just junk DNA. We cannot dismiss it as junk DNA. In fact, this paper that was published in Nucleic Acid Research by some of these co-authors of the You et al. Paper, they talk about how it is this non-coding repetitive DNA that is non-B DNA can be very, very important for formatting the function of genomes. So we can't just dismiss it as junk DNA because it's clearly not. So we're about 15 to 16% genetically different from the chimpanzee when you look at the entire genome. So this is obviously very different from the claim that we are only 1 or 2% genetically different from chimps. I would say it's different by about an order of magnitude compared to the common claim you'll hear said that we are only 1 or 1.2% genetically different from chimps. So this refutes that old icon of evolution and shows that it was based upon inaccurate scientific information. I would also add, by the way, that the argument that we are, X% different from chimps is not even a valid logical argument against human-chimp common ancestry. I mean, let's say that we are, in fact, 99% genetically similar, only 1% genetically different. Those similarities could be the result of common ancestry, I grant that, but they could also be the result of common design, because designers will very frequently reuse functional parts that work in different systems. So for example, we see wheels being reused on both cars and airplanes. We see keyboards being reused on, cell phones and tablets. If you think of computer programming, programmers will often reuse or borrow or steal code from different programs and use different coding modules that they need to perform similar functions in different programs. So it's a very common design principle to reuse parts and components that work in different designs using essentially common blueprints. So the fact that we are whatever X% similar we are to chimps, whether it's 1% different, 5% different, 15% different, or whatever, I don't think that any of those percentages really tell you anything about whether we share a common ancestor, because those similarities could be the result of common design just as much as they could be the result of common descent. And I've been saying this for many, many years, going back to 2008. I just don't think that the percent genetic similarity or difference really is a relevant argument to determining whether or not we share a common ancestor with chimps. What it is relevant, though, is to a specific argument that some of our friends in the evolution community have been making, where they've said that we are only 1.2% genetically different, and they have said that somehow that demonstrates that we share a common ancestor with apes. What my argument has been is that their argument is an icon of evolution, and it's wrong on both the facts and the logic. It's wrong on the facts because we now know from You et al. That we're not 1.2% genetically different. We're more like 15% genetically different. So this old 1%, statistic that we're only 1% different from chimps is just factually wrong. And then it's wrong on the logic because there's no logical reason why any percent genetic similarity or difference between humans and chimps necessarily dictates that we do or do not share a common ancestor with chimps. It's just not a logically valid argument.
Chaos theory.